Hello everyone, I'm Rugile from Magical Little Dreams. In the last video, I've showed you how to make these nice trees from our forest quilt behind me with turned edges. In this video, I'm going to show you how to prepare and assemble this cute little bear from our forest quilt, also with turned edges. It is possible to make this bear using raw edge machine applique technique. It is a little quicker and somewhat easier. For detailed tutorial on raw edge machine applique, refer to my other video tutorial. Yet, as I do not like the looks of the satin stitch and the fraying edges, I prefer to make all my appliques with turned edges. In this video, I will walk you through all the steps needed to make this bear, including how to turn the edge of this teeny tiny nose here. So stick around and let's make this bear together. We will make this bear applique in 3 steps. First, we will turn the edges of the bear body, belly, and the face using interfacing. Second, we will turn the edges of the nose using fusible web. Lastly, we will finish the bear by quickly embroidering the arms, the mouth, and the eyes, and we'll stitch all the parts together. But first, let's see what equipment and materials we will need. General sewing equipment like scissors, washable fabric pen, seam ripper, a needle, some pins, an iron, and a sewing machine. In addition, I will use a few tools from a new manicure toolbox to aid the handling of the tiny shapes, especially the nose. Specifically, I will use an eyebrow tweezers to easily pick up and rotate the shape. Then, I will need a cuticle trimmer to hold the fabric in place with its fork head. I will also use a bevel-shaped cuticle pusher to fold and press the seam allowance fabric. And finally, I will need a second cuticle pusher that is flat and round. I will use it in the hardly accessible places, such as the ears. Instead of manicure tools, you can of course use Applique tools that are specifically designed for this purpose. We will also need some fabric, a background fabric, and 2 contrasting fabrics for the bear. I will use dark brown for the body and the nose, and the lighter brown for the belly and the face. Similarly, we will need 2 contrasting threads that match fabric colors. I will use white and dark brown. And of course, we will need an outline. I put a link to the bear applique pattern in the video description below. To easily turn the edges of the bear belly, body, and face, we will use a piece of interfacing. You can use fusible interfacing, non-fusible interfacing, embroidery stabilizer, or even a lightweight fabric. As long as it is not in stretch and lightweight, it works. For the nose of the bear that is too tiny to use the interfacing, we will need some paper-backed fusible web to turn the edges. We will also need a piece of parchment paper to handle the pieces and to protect the iron. And that's it! We are ready to make the bear. Let's start by turning the edges of body, belly, and face. First, trace all outlines on a piece of interfacing using a disappearing or washable fabric pen. Leave sufficient space around each shape for 1/4 inch, which would be around 7 mm wide, seam allowance. Also trace the arm and the eye contours. We will use that later. Additionally, trace a second outline both for the belly and for the face. The reason for that is that both the belly and the face will be made from a light fabric and appliqued on a very dark fabric. We will need that second layer of interfacing to bag these light shapes to avoid shadowing. Once all the shapes are transferred, cut them out roughly, leaving sufficient space for a seam allowance around the outline. Next, place the cut-out outline on the right side of the fabric, allowing for the seam allowance on both the fabric and the interfacing. If you are using a fusible interfacing, make sure the rough side with the glue is facing the fabric. For the belly and the face, sandwich the light fabric between the 2 layers of interfacing. The top layer will be used to turn the edge, whereas the bottom layer will separate the light fabric from the dark background and prevent shadowing. Now we are ready to move to the sewing machine. There, stitch around the outline on the interfacing using a straight line stitch. Stitch slowly. Avoid stitching long straight lines, as those will be visible in the final applique piece and the shape may become edgy. This means you need to turn slightly yet frequently, even at shallow curves. At the sharp turns, such as the legs and the ears, you may need to stop and turn at every stitch to make a nice and smooth curve. Complete the bare body and do the same for the belly and the face. Once the interfacing and the fabric are sewn together, cut out the shapes with 1/4 inch to 1/8 inch seam allowance, which would be around 5 to 7 millimeters wide. I am using pinking shears to reduce fabric bulk. You can also use your regular fabric scissors. In that case, it is advisable to make cuts into the seam allowance every few millimeters to reduce fabric bulging. Next, let's prep the seam allowance for turning. For that, first identify sharp inner points and inward curves. At the inward curves, every few millimeters make several cuts into the seam allowance all the way to the stitch line. Be careful not to cut into the seam thread. Yet, if you do cut into the seam thread, do not panic. Just get back to the sewing machine and stitch a few stitches around the cut to quickly fix it. At the sharp inner points, make a single cut straight to the point. Position the scissors in the middle between the neighboring seams to maximize the seam allowance on both sides of the cut. You also need to reduce the amount of fabric around the outer points and narrow parts, such as the tip of the face or the ears of the body. Do not cut too close to the stitch line though, as this will remove the seam allowance and the seam may tear when turning inside out. This step is especially important when using regular scissors instead of pinking shears to cut out the shape, as in that case the fabric bulk remains bigger. We are now ready to turn the shapes inside out. For that, cut the opening in the interfacing first with your fabric scissors. Do not cut too close to the seam. Stop cutting at least 1/4 inch away from the seam for the small shapes and leave even more uncut interfacing for the large body shape. Be also careful not to cut into the fabric, especially for the small belly and face. There, if you do not feel comfortable to do it with scissors, use a seam ripper to make a small opening first and only then widen it with the scissors. Now it is time to turn the shape inside out through the opening we've just created. Use your fingers to turn as much as feels comfortable. Do not worry about ears and legs just yet, just get the bulk of the shape inside out. For the tiny face and perhaps even for the belly, use eyebrow tweezers to grab and hold the fabric when turning. With such small shapes, it becomes hard to handle them with your fingers alone. To fully push out the seam, use some pointy yet blunt tool. My favorite is the round edge of the scissor blade. The pointy blade is too sharp and will poke the fabric. So put the round scissor blade inside the turned out shape and push the seam out. Press onto the fabric and not interfacing, as the latter can easily tear. Press the seam until you see the stitch line thread between the interfacing and the fabric. Then you know for certain that the seam is fully out. The other indicator that the seam is properly pushed out is nice and round curve compared to successive straight lines in partially turned out shape. I use the scissors only for the bare body and the belly, as the face is too tiny. I will do it with a smaller tool. Specifically, I will use a flat cuticle pusher from a manicure toolbox. The scissor blade is also too big for the narrow parts of the bare body, such as the ears. The legs are a little edgy too, so I'll try to push the seam a bit more there to make these curves smoother. If you do cut into the seam thread, or tear it while pushing out as I did here, do not worry. I will just finish turning the rest of the seam and show you how to quickly fix this problem. So to fix any sort of cut in the seam, simply turn back the tiny part with a cut. No need to turn the whole shape back, just enough to make the interfacing and the fabric to lay flat. Then, get back to the sewing machine and stitch a few stitches around the cut. Once the cut is sealed, turn the shape right side out again. Push the seam with the fingers, scissors, or the tool that's needed. Continue to push the seam for the other shapes. The belly looks fine, whereas I have not yet pushed the seam for the face shape. It was too tiny for the scissor blade. So I will do it now with the flat cuticle pusher. Because the face is small and the opening is rather close to the seam, interfacing tends to turn together with the fabric. Hold it tight when pushing the seam and press the edge of the shape with your fingers to force the interfacing to the back of the shape again. Finally, if some points are still stubborn and do not fully come out, like the tip of the face, pull the fabric from the outside using a needle. Be careful to grab a large chunk of fabric with a needle and pull gently, as individual threads or even the entire seam allowance, if it's very narrow, may completely come out. Now, all but one shapes are ready. Let's put them aside for a moment and prepare the last one, teeny tiny nose. The easiest and the quickest method to turn the edges of such a tiny shape is Applique technique. Yet it relies on rather expensive Applique tools that are not even available at my location. So here I will show you my own method to turn the edges of such tiny shapes. My method uses the same principles as the Applique technique, just exchanges the glue and the interfacing with paper-backed fusible web and the Applique rods with readily accessible manicure tools. If you do have an Applique system, you're very welcome to use it. Yet, If you do not have it on hand, you may as well try the method I will show you here. So let's get started by cutting out 5 small pieces of the paper-backed fusible web. We will need all of them to make one nose. Then, let's trace the nose outline on 2 of the fusible web pieces. One we will use to make a thick nose template. The second we will need to back the finished shape with an additional layer of the fusible web at the very end. So let's put the second piece with the traced nose outline aside for later. For the next step, lay down the parchment paper to protect the table. Then do 2 things. First, bag the fabric with the fusible web to be able to glue the folded seam allowance to the back of the shape. And second, make a thick template to be able to fold the seam allowance against. For that, put 1 piece of fusible web onto the back side of the fabric with the fusible web facing down. Next to it, fuse 3 fusible web pieces to generate a thick template. As a top piece, put the one with the marked nose outline. Make sure the fusible web is facing one direction in all the pieces. Hold the parchment paper to protect the iron and press with a hot iron to fuse. Once it cools down a little and the glue becomes hard again, remove the fabric and the 3-layer fusible web piece. From the latter, cut out the traced nose shape to generate a thick applique template. Make sure to cut out a very nice and round shape. Any inaccuracies or remaining corners will intervene with you turning the fabric and prevent you from making a smooth applique edge. At the same go, cut out a second nose shape from the fusible web piece that we have left for later. Now, stick the thick applique template to the back side of the fusible web backed fabric. Cover with parchment paper and press with a hot iron to fuse. Do not iron, just press to avoid layer shifting. Then, cut out the applique shape from the fabric with an additional 1/4 inch to 1/8 inch seam allowance, which would be around 4 to 7 mm wide. Since the nose is tiny, let's zoom in for the next steps to see it better. Now, we need to remove the paper lining only from the seam allowance fabric. To do that, take a needle and scratch around the perimeter of the hard 3-layer nose template to separate the paper on the seam allowance from the rest. Work slowly and diligently to scratch very close to the thick template. To ease the removal of the paper, make a few scratches on the sides. Once you scratch around the thick nose template in the center and make a few cross scratches, carefully remove the paper from the seam allowance. You may use the tweezers to grab the paper. Leave the thick applique outline in the center attached. If it does come off a little, like it did for me here, do not worry. You can reattach it by pressing with a hot iron or simply hold it in place while turning the seam. The important is to have this hard edge of the template around to be able to fold the seam allowance against. The next step is to pre-fold the seam allowance. With the help of bevel cuticle pusher, Fold the seam allowance over the thick applique template. Hold the folded fabric in place with the fork head of a cuticle trimmer. Press the fold with the bevel cuticle pusher several times to make a stable crease. At the sharp curves, turn the seam allowance frequently in small increments to create a smooth curve. The shape is very tiny, and it may be hard to handle it at the very beginning. It may take you a couple of tries until you get used to turning these relatively large edges for such a tiny applique piece. Once completed, check how it looks from the front, if it's nice and round and without any sharp corners. So let's move on and remove the paper template in the center. You may use tweezers to aid the process. Then, collect the seam allowance fabric again using pre-made folding lines. Hold the fabric in place with a cuticle trimmer and then press the edge with a hot iron to attach. Work in small increments, small enough to make sure all the fabric is folded nicely and fits under the fork head of the cuticle trimmer. Go around the shape, pressing onto the edge only. This way, you may correct if needed. Once you are happy with the folding, press the entire nose to stick all the seam allowance fabric to the back of the shape. Finally, bag the teeny tiny nose with an additional layer of the fusible web that we have cut out earlier. This enables you to iron fuse the nose in place before stitching. And here it is, the teeny tiny nose, nice, round and with turned edges. The seam allowance is folded on all the applique pieces. It's time to assemble all the parts together and to decorate the bear with the arms, the eyes and the mouth. We shall start with all the parts that require light thread first. That means embroidering the arms, the eyes, and stitching down the face and the belly. Let's start with the arms. There are two ways to embroider them, either from the front or from the back. I will stitch the arms from the back and use the traces I made on the interfacing of the bear body at the very beginning. To make the arms a little more prominent, use a triple straight line stitch, also called a triple stretch stitch. It is thicker than a simple straight line stitch, as the needle goes forward, backward and forward again at every stitch. When stitching from the back, it is important to pull out the bobbin thread. This prevents thread knotting in the front of the applique shape. If you form a knot, however, you may need to rip that seam apart and start over again. So stitch on the line to make the arms. Once the stitching is done, check if the stitch line is nice in the front. There's always the danger that some thread may get tangled when stitching from the back. The arms look good this time, so let's hide the threads in the back of the bear body and secure with a knot. Repeat the same to make the second arm. So the arms are ready. Let's make the eyes next. You can either embroider them by hand or use a variation of a satin stitch called the bead stitch on your machine. You need only one bead from the bead stitch that makes a nice circle. It is always a good idea to make a test stitch before you actually stitch on the applique shape to see how many layers of interfacing you need to avoid puckering. With my settings, a single layer of interfacing that I already have on the applique shape is sufficient. So I will go ahead and embroider the eyes. I will use the markings I have on the back of the bear body shape. When stitching from the back, don't forget to pull out the bobbin thread to avoid thread knotting on the front of the bear applique. Make a single bead. I use 0.3 mm stitch length and 6 mm stitch width for this bear. Once finished, check if you like how the eyes look in front. Then make both eyes and hide the threads. The embroidery part with the light thread is complete. The last step with this thread is to attach the belly and the face. For that, position the bear body on the background fabric first. Then, place the belly and the face. The bottom of the belly should extend beyond the bottom line of the arms, whereas the top of the face should be placed only slightly above the eye line. If you use fusible interfacing, then fuse, otherwise pin the belly and the face in place and go to the sewing machine to stitch them down. To attach the applique shape, you can use any stitch you like. I am using the straight line stitch as it is the fastest. When top stitching with the straight line stitch, make sure to stitch around 1 mm away from the edge. Stitch slowly to make all the curves nice and round. Once finished, hide and secure the threads. Now all the parts that require light thread are complete, so exchange the light thread with the dark one. To finish the bear, attach the nose, embroider the mouth, and top stitch the body to the background fabric. Let's start from the nose. There, peel off the paper lining first. Then place the teeny tiny nose at the top of the bottom third of the face. Press with a hot iron to fuse. Do not iron, just press to avoid shifting. Then get back to the sewing machine to attach it. To stitch down the nose, use the same stitch as for the belly and the face. In my case, it is a straight line stitch. You may want to reduce the stitch step size to be able to make smooth curves on such a tiny shape. I'm using 2 mm stitch length. Stitch slowly and correct if the needle ends the stitch outside of the nose edge, as I did here. Here I was not turning the nose sufficiently, so I had to correct it even twice. We are working with a really very tiny shape, so we need to be very precise and even more patient. Once done stitching, hide the threads again. At last, the finished nose is nice and round. Next, let's embroider the mouth. For that, I did not make any markings, but I will follow a simple routine instead. I will make 2 stitches down from the center at the bottom of the nose. From there, I will make 2 stitches sideways, one pointing a little downwards and the other a little upwards. Then I will stitch back to the center line following the stitches I've just made. From there, I will repeat the same, just to the other side. I will make 2 stitches sideways, first facing downwards and the second facing upwards, and stitch back to the center line. Lastly, I will finish the mouth by stitching back up to the nose. So to do that at your sewing machine, position the needle in the center at the bottom of the nose first. You may mark this position beforehand. Then stitch 2 stitches down. Next, make a single stitch sideways facing a little downwards. Next, make one more stitch to the side, but this time pointed a little up, to create a smile. Rotate the bear and stitch back, repeating the 2 last stitches. Now do the same to the other side. Make 2 stitches sideways, the first pointing a little down and the second going a little up. Stitch back to the center line. Finish the mouth by stitching on the center line back up to the nose. Once finished, pull the threads to the back. The mouth is complete and the bear is almost ready. The last step is to attach the body of the bear to the background fabric. Get back to the sewing machine and top stitch around the perimeter of the bear body in the same way as you did for the belly and the face and the nose. When using straight line stitch, position the needle around 1 mm away from the edge. As the last step, hide and secure the threads. Congratulations, the bear is complete! I hope making this bear was easy and a lot of fun. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video. Bye!